Hello. Well, I'm in the village of Brampton in Suffolk, talking to Nick Saltmarsh and Josiah Meldrum, who in 2012 founded the company called Hodmedods. And I'll ask them to explain what Hodmedods is and why you gave it this extraordinary, attractive name.
Oh, thanks, Colin. I'm Josiah Meldrum, and I'm with Nick and a friend, William. We founded Hodmedod in 2012, and it grew really out of the idea that we simply don't eat or grow enough pulses in the UK. These fantastic seeds of leguminous plants that fix nitrogen, create amino acids and proteins in their seeds, and which we can be eating. And we'd run a project with a community group called East Anglia Food Link and Transition Norwich, investigating what a more sustainable food system might look like, and asking the question, could Norwich, our regional city, feed itself from its hinterland? And we came to the conclusion that it could, but not without significant dietary and land use changes. And one of those changes was growing more nitrogen-fixing plants and eating more of their seeds, the leguminous plants, the beans and peas. And what began as a sort of a thought experiment in Norwich ended up being something that we became incredibly enthused and inspired by, and led us to create Hodmedod, a business to continue that work of encouraging farmers to grow those crops and people to eat them in 2012. And the name, because we were working with overlooked and forgotten foods, the beans and peas that had historically been eaten but were no longer being consumed, we decided to use a traditional dialect word. And in East Anglia, we have some fantastic words, but they too are disappearing. And Hodmedod is a word for a hedgehog or a snail, or possibly even a small curled up thing, so a seed. And we love the idea of reviving a dialect word at the same time as reviving these foods.
You're not advocating eating hedgehogs?
No.
Not yet.
Anything you want to add to that, Nick?
I think Josiah's explained the origins, very clearly. I guess one element of it was that when we started looking at how we might support and encourage farmers to grow more pulses and the people in Norwich and beyond to eat more, we thought about the pulses that are most common in the diet, in our diets at the moment. And those tend to be imported pulses. We're most familiar in Britain now with chickpeas and with lentils, and of course the beloved baked bean, which has become one of the national dishes of Britain, but really relatively recently, and is always made with imported beans, generally grown in America. Baked beans, yes, in tins of baked beans.
Great.
So we started thinking about whether there were possibilities of growing those crops around Norwich, in the agricultural hinterland of Norwich and further afield in the UK. And then we realised that actually there were more established pulse crops that were already being grown fairly widely, particularly different varieties of dried pea, which grow fantastically in our climate and are one of our most neglected foods, but also one of our best crops, and fava beans, which is really the original old world bean that originated in the Fertile Crescent, was one of the very early crops to come to Britain, would have been a big part of our diet for centuries, for thousands of years, and then fell out of our diet. But farmers kept growing them because they're excellent food, not just for people, but also for animals. And although we stopped eating them in Britain, they remained in demand in other parts of the world, particularly the Middle East and North Africa. And a lot of British beans are still exported to those parts of the world.
Really?
So we sort of shifted our initial emphasis from looking at new pulse crops that might be grown to actually looking at how we might encourage people to eat the pulse crops that are already grown in the UK. And then later on, we sort of came back to those new crops and looked at trialling production of chickpeas and lentils with farmers in East Anglia as well.
Let's just look at fava beans a bit more. I mean, they are genus Vicia, are they not? Which are the vetches. And under the category of the kind of fava beans that you grow in Britain, broad beans are the ones that we eat, but there's also all these ones that are grown for animals, field beans, tick beans, etc., horse beans. Could you like to expand on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the New World beans, as we call them in a rather Eurocentric way, the haricot beans and the runner beans and all of those different coloured beans that have a lot of different appearance, but are all the same species.
Kidney beans.
Kidney beans, we're really used to differentiating them by common names. Whereas with the fava bean, because they all look quite similar, but they're different in sizes, we're not so used to seeing the differences between them and understanding that Vicia faba major, the large broad bean that was really popularised by the Victorians, is eaten green, certainly in the UK. And the smaller beans, field beans, tick beans, are the ones that are generally eaten dry. And that's partly because we can grow them to dry in the field. They don't need any additional drying. They die at the end of the growing season, and then they're harvested in really from mid-August on, a bit later this year and a bit later further north. Whereas with broad beans, it's very, very difficult to do that on a field scale.
And is there any prospect of people eating tick beans and field beans?
Totally. That is exactly what we're offering them.
That's what we've been doing for the last 10 years, is trying to persuade people to eat them, because they really are. I mean, when we first realised that these beans were actually fairly widely grown, but they weren't eaten, we initially thought, well, there must be a good reason why they're not eaten. They must just not be very nice to eat. And then when we tried them and discovered all the ways that they're cooked in the Middle East and North Africa, and realised that they are actually a fantastically tasty bean, they've just, for historical reasons, fallen out of our diet, because we shifted, the sort of dietary change that has happened all over the world as regions have become sort of wealthier and agriculture has developed and become more industrialised. There's a dietary shift away from pulses to animal proteins. That happened in Britain hundreds of years ago, and the field beans, the tick beans, the small fava beans, basically became seen as the food of the poor, because only poor people had to keep eating them to get the protein they needed. So they just became completely stigmatised, fell out of fashion. We stopped eating them. We started eating the sort of more sort of sumptuous, large, broad beans, fresh as a seasonal delicacy, but just forgot about the fava beans. But they are nonetheless an excellent food. And now we can get over that historical stigma and rediscover the joys of getting a lot of our protein from pulses.
Indeed.
It's time to come back to fava beans and get them back into our diets. And that's what we've been spending a lot of the last 10 years doing, trying to show how that...
Tick beans, though, I think I've tried them. They've got fairly tough skins, haven't they?
So there are different varieties, much as there are with all the phaseolus beans, the beans from the Americas. And there are thinner skinned varieties and there are thick skinned. We actually use, for our whole beans, we use a variety called Maris Bead, which is about 50 years old. And is a delicious bean. It's very small relative to, say, a broad bean. It's sort of fingernail sized, and it has a thin skin and it cooks quite quickly. In Egypt, they'd call them bathhouse beans. They're cooked overnight on a fire on the coals that are used to heat the bathhouses, and then served as full madames in the morning. And I think one of the things we realised was that there is this huge, and as Nick described, this global cuisine that really is unknown in the UK because there was no availability of the beans. But when you start to experiment with those dishes, and the sort of millennia, in fact, of tradition around eating them, there are some amazing recipes, and they really are fantastic. And I think one of the things that surprised us early on when we were talking to farmers about the possibility of growing chickpeas or lentils, when we thought that's what we needed to do, was how attuned they were to the North African and the Middle Eastern market, knowing when the dates of Ramadan were, in order to get the best premium market on exported beans. And it was quite surprising, and that's what led us to look at those global recipes, and then later to realise that fava beans, they occur in the form of curry, the first recipe book in the English language, which was a recipe book probably for very high status royal household.
What sort of date?
That is 14th century.
Really?
So
14th.
And they would have been eaten way before then, and they appear in the written record really into the sort of 18th century, 19th century, and then they completely disappear. But they wouldn't have, they wouldn't have disappeared from the homes of people that weren't using written recipe books. They would still have been in traditional foodstuffs, but we just lost track of them.
And just on the question of the thick skin, so I mean, all fava beans tend to have thicker skins than phaseolus beans, but like most pulses, fava beans can be used in two very different forms in the kitchen. So you can use the whole beans, and they're obviously they're intact and in their skin, and fava beans, with the right sort of cooking, the skin will actually become, however thick the skin of the variety, it will become really soft and tender. So when fulmedam is cooked in Egypt, for example, they cook it for it's a very long, slow cooking process, during which the skin will become really tender and soft. But the other form that fava beans and most other pulses are used is as a split pulse, where we call them split, but really the main thing about them is they've had the skin removed. So there you get away from the issue of there being a thick skin at all, and split pulses cook much more readily because you can get the water and heat into the pulse much more easily, and can be used in different ways. So to make, falafel or dal, and they cook down very soft, much quicker than a whole bean.
Great. I do, as I say, want to focus on pulses, but one thing about them is that they beautifully complement cereals, don't they? I mean, there are three really, but two particular classes of staple foods that provide calories on the one hand and protein on the other. Cereals are the main ones, but the pulses as a whole traditionally run them a close second, don't they?
But I'd even dispute that pulses should be second. But I think the fantastic thing is that pulses and cereals go hand in hand in the field, where the pulses fix the nitrogen, and if they're grown together in the field or in rotation, then the cereals get some of the fertility benefit that the pulses are putting into the soil. So they go hand in hand in the soil, and then at the dawn of agriculture, they would have been grown together or alongside each other from almost the very beginning of farming. But they also go together in our diets, complementing each other with, the complete range of amino acids to give us a complete protein source. Not that with our sort of current British diets, that's really anything we need to worry about at all, because we all have a surfeit of protein, so we're getting plenty of all the amino acids, regardless.
Would you like to expand on that? Because I like this amino acid story. One of them is deficient in lysine, I think, and the other. Can you expand?
Yeah, I mean, so pulses, particularly peas, are actually very close to being perfect proteins. They almost have everything, but they're completed by a cereal, by a grain. And I think the key thing to say is that these are the amino acids our bodies can't synthesize, and there are 9 of them. The others we can make ourselves from those building blocks. If you look at traditional cuisines all around the world, it's always, the basis of what people would proudly call peasant cookery is that pulse and grain combination, whether it's rice and peas or chapati and dal or fulmedam and a flatbread. And those are dishes and combinations that people have subsisted on for millennia, and they are delicious, and they provide you with all that you need. And I think small amounts of meat really complement those dishes, and that's what would have happened in those cultures where meat was at a premium and expensive and difficult to come by.
And what would be the sort of British equivalent of frijoles con tortillas and dal and
mushy peas?
Mushy peas.
So mushy peas are really interesting because we now think of them as that lowly thing that you might have with your fish and chips, but that's really an echo of street food and peasant food, historically. And mushy peas themselves are really a version of the pottage that would have sustained people through the winter, which would have been a base of usually of a pulse, probably peas, with maybe some cereal grains in it as well. But then wild herbs, hedgerow herbs, a bit of meat when it was available. The nursery rhyme about peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old was all about that pot that you had through the winter that was cooking pulses and grains, and with additional field vegetables or wild herbs and occasionally meat.
I mean, you should open a restaurant, shouldn't you, and serve these things to genuinely demonstrate that they work.
Yeah, I think
it'd be great to have the time to
it
do
would
that.
be amazing to do that.
It'd be great to have the time. We'd love to do that, but we've got plenty to be doing. Just
but it ought to be done.
It ought to be done.
Available.
There are people doing interesting things. So in the northeast, obviously, there's the tradition of peas pudding, which would be cooked in a muslin with a ham, and is that's a very old recipe. And we had a fantastic customer who called us up, who was running a small business doing peas pudding. And I said, how do you market it? He said, it's Geordie hummus. Geordie hummus. And it's absolutely delicious. And it's a really simple dish just made with yellow peas. And you can add other flavourings to it.
You've got a recipe book there, haven't you?
We haven't actually produced a recipe book. We have a collection of many recipes, well over 100 or 200 now on our website. We haven't actually pulled those together into a book, and they're not all our recipes. We've sort of gathered recipes over the years from lots of wonderful cooks and chefs who have contributed recipes to us. And I mean, what you say about opening a restaurant to show what can be done, the fantastic thing that we've seen over the last 10 years is just that pulses have been coming back into fashion, for want of a better word. When we started, a very common reaction to pulses when we said this is what we're getting these pulses from British farmers and we're making them available. Very common reaction was a sort of worthy, dusty food that wasn't particularly interesting, was not exciting to eat. But over the last 10 years, there's been a real shift. I think as people have realised the many benefits, both for us, for our health, but also environmentally, of eating more plant proteins, and more different cuisines have sort of been shared and experienced in Britain. We've realised that pulses really are exciting ingredients, and there are lots of cookery writers, extolling the virtues of pulses, doing exciting things with them, and lots of restaurants now serving great dishes made with pulses.
And do you feel that you yourselves, Hodmedods, have contributed to this reincarnation?
We've certainly ridden a wave, and I think in some degrees we've really significantly contributed to that change, particularly with the UK pulses, which I think no one was really thinking about. I think they were very much hidden away, and we've been very noisy. We're still a very small business, but we've been very noisy about what it is that we're trying to do. I mean, I know everyone runs a purpose-driven business these days, but we really do have a very clear purpose about changing diets and land use. And so we're always keen to talk to people and to explain why these crops are so fantastic, both for our health and nutrition, but also for the farmed environment and the wider ecosystem. And I think that I'd say we've had an effect. I think that's...
And I mean, in particular, raising awareness of fava beans, which were almost unheard of. Barely anyone we talked to at the beginning had heard of fava beans, or was aware even that they were grown on farms in the UK already, and that there were these beans. And the other pulse that we got excited about very early was the Colin pea.
What bean?
The Colin pea, which is a dark brown. If you look at them very closely, they have a fantastic sort of marbled skin. It's a dark brown variety of dry pea. And they've been grown in Britain, certainly for hundreds of years, if not for longer. Almost completely forgotten, except for in pockets of the country, in the northwest. Getting my geography muddled up.
Northeast too.
The northwest. They're still prized and eaten as what's called parched peas. In the West Midlands, they're known as grey peas and are still enjoyed. But elsewhere, they're almost unheard of. And when we talked about Colin peas 10 years ago, unless people came from those particular parts of the country, they'd never heard of them. Whereas now they're quite widely recognised and appreciated.
What genus are they?
They're a common pea, what used to be
a pea,
but now lathyrus.
Okay. I'd like to talk about the range, though, of pulses briefly, on a sort of botanical level. So can we go through them? We've more or less done some of it, but we've really got beans, peas, chickpeas, which I think should be considered separately, and lentils. In the beans, we've got the kidney beans, phaseolus, which we've talked about. We've got soya beans, which we haven't talked about, and we've got the fava beans, including the broad beans, etc., which we've been talking about. Would you like to expand on, well, there's nothing more to say about it, but soya beans, any future in this country? People used to get very excited about them.
Yeah, I mean, they're complicated in all sorts of reasons. There are a couple of leguminous plants that we certainly struggle with, partly because they don't grow very well here, but also because they are on a list of allergens, 14 allergens, which we have to be very wary of when we're processing food. And lupins are one of those, and so are soya beans. And because we don't have a tradition of handling either in the UK broadly, it's very difficult to encourage anyone to make them part of their system in terms of crop cleaning after harvest or processing them further than that, beyond that point. And I think soya beans are interesting because they're actually an oil seed rather than a pulse crop, which is always slightly confusing because they're principally used to crush oil. And I think they are grown in the UK. I think it remains incredibly marginal. I think it would be fair to say they're a difficult crop to get to harvest because they're not very weed competitive, and because they mature late in the season. And so the easiest and the most likely way to grow them is to actually desiccate them, to use a herbicide at the end of the year, so that they can then be more readily harvested. And obviously, that's not something we're particularly keen on. Lupins are a fantastic food as well. And lupins have hardly any carbohydrates, but they're about 40% protein. They're an extraordinarily nutritious seed, but again, because of their allergen status, they're quite difficult to handle.
I think they're also more difficult, and certainly we're even less familiar with them in Britain than with fava beans. They're more difficult to cook. Soybeans are great for processing. They're not brilliant in the kitchen, or I'm certainly not aware of ways that they can be used sort of easily and to good effect in the kitchen. And lupins have quite particular uses, but again, there's not the same sort of broad tradition of different ways of using lupins. So I think we took on enough of a challenge persuading people to eat fava beans, where there was a sort of distant history of eating them in this country, and there was, in the Mediterranean and relatively close in global terms, there were lots of ways that they were used and cooked. Lupins are eaten in the Mediterranean, but generally just sort of boiled and salted as a snack. They're not sort of broadly used in many dishes. So I think fava beans were enough of a challenge. Encouraging people to sort of start eating soybeans and lupins in a significant way would be even more difficult.
Sure. I have tried cooking lupins actually, and they weren't very nice.
They take a lot of cooking.
Yeah.
And I think
and there's
like
also
soybeans,
the Russell lupins, which people grow in their gardens, the ornamentals. They're not at all good, are they?
No, so they do have alkaloids in them. There are 3 points of kind of emergence of lupins. I think there's Australian, there's European, and there's South American. And the ones that are eaten for human consumption obviously need to be low in those alkaloids, which is quite tricky to do. They're bred to be low alcohol. Some of them are naturally occurringly. But traditionally they'd have been soaked and sort of rinsed and soaked and rinsed in order to make them less bitter. So they're not the easiest food crops.
And there are crops out there that one might theoretically say it'd be nice to grow, like soya.
Yeah.
Actually, it's much better to import them in smallish quantities.
I think there's a lot to be said for working with the agro-ecosystem that we have. And I mean, the thing that we are, as Nick has already said, the thing that we're really, really well placed to grow in the UK is peas. And there's a huge diversity of pea varieties. We have exactly the right climate for them. We grow the best peas in the world in the UK, which I think people sort of overlook. Peas grown in the UK, particularly dark peas like the Carlins and marrow-fat peas, are exported to other parts of the world where they're really highly prized, particularly in Southeast Asia, where they're used to make wasabi paste, but they're also used, the dark peas are used to make a kind of a sweet dessert pea. I think we need to really celebrate what we can grow brilliantly here.
Yes, and we should be proud of our peas. And a bit like the beans, the way we think of broad beans now is, that's what we think of, obviously thinking about a sort of Vicia bean.
Yeah.
We think of peas as being green and fresh, or more likely frozen, but we need to remember that for most of our history, most peas have been dried. And they come in much greater variety than, just fresh green peas, and we need to be proud of those and celebrate them and enjoy them.
I think we've got 8 or 9 varieties downstairs at the moment of peas.
Have they? Let's be a bit botanical. I mean, when peas at the moment, we're talking about the genus Lathyrus, they're the green ones.
Yeah.
Ordinary peas. Are Carlins Lathyrus?
They are. Sometimes they're further broken down as arvensis, but I don't think that's very often the case. They are essentially just a variety of a cultivar of pea.
Are they?
They're probably quite similar to the peas that would have been grown all across Northern Europe before plant breeding, in the crudest sense, in the sort of 16th, 17th century, began to create yellow peas and green peas, the ones that we're most familiar with. These would have been the field peas. These would have been grown in maslins, in mixtures with cereals, and harvested with those cereals all across Europe. And in fact, there are traditions very similar to those that Nick described in the West Midlands and in the North East all across Northern Europe. So Latvia has a very strong tradition around eating these peas at particular times of year, and in Sweden as well, and in Norway. So I think we should look at all these varieties. And in fact, the just up the road we have a fantastic resource, which is the John Innes Centre's germplasm unit, their seed bank, and they have thousands and thousands of accessions that are all peas. And going to see them and saying I mean, they are beautiful because they're all so different, sort of in terms of their appearance, but also their flavours. And obviously, when you manage a seed bank or when you're a plant breeder, the thing that you don't do is eat the things. You're interested in yield and disease resistance, and asking questions about flavour are quite unusual. And I think there's a huge untapped resource there of thinking about peas that have different purposes in the way that marrow-fat peas are very, very different to these Carlin peas.
I'm interested actually in John Innes because, as it were, in the 80s, I'm going to say in my day, but still my day, anyway, in the 1980s, it was a government-owned institution, and it would freely deal with people like you. Has it in fact been privatised, and is it still as open as it was?
I think it's still as open as it was. They've always been incredibly interested in what we're doing and very supportive. And
very good.
We've had a few visits up to the germplasm unit to look at what they've got. We engage with the research scientists, particularly those that are looking at peas, inevitably. And they're still a publicly funded research institution. I think the problem is that with all of these institutions, they're essentially a pipeline for the private sector. They're doing the pre-breeding and the development work and the research science that leads to commercialization in other spaces. But they do really good work. And I think often they're tarred with the brush of the Sainsbury's laboratory and the genetic engineering that's going on there. But there's a lot more happening, and
sure.
Really interesting science.
And the seed bank is accessible. If you want to trial or grow out or breed any of the accessions they've got, you can request a sample. The problem is the sample is very small. So we got very excited on one of our first visits by Abyssinian peas, which are actually a different species to the common pea. Abyssinian. So they historically grew in Ethiopia and were treated as a feast food in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, they eat a lot of peas, but what we call the Abyssinian pea would have been a very prized, special type of pea that would have been eaten on special occasions. And we got very excited by some of these. And one of the types in particular was this sort of dark black, almost velvety pea that just looked amazing. So we requested a sample, and I think got maybe a dozen peas. And it just takes a long time to multiply those up to any scale, which we have taken them through several generations.
I can show you to them in a minute. They are beautiful
peas. It's on hold because it's just a very long process. Particularly, it varies from crop to crop, but peas don't produce you don't multiply up by a huge number every generation.
Incidentally, I've had conversations with people who should know better, people in high places, who have said, well, now we've got all this fantastic range of crops of all kinds, as it were, on tap. If we needed to change direction, we could change direction in no time at all. And of course you couldn't, for the reason you're saying. It takes ages and ages and ages to multiply up, decades.
Yeah.
So there's no quick fixes.
No, there are no quick fixes. And I think looking for there's often a desire to find the silver bullet, the quick fix, the crop that's going to replace X. If we're having problems with oilseed rape because of disease, then what are we going to drop into the rotation? And obviously we would advocate for a radical review of the whole rotation, and that really the answer lies in diversity, and that's where resilience is rested, and that we need to be growing a greater diversity of crops across a farm, but also potentially within the same field, and looking at bicropping and polycropping as an answer to some of those problems, rather than just what's going to be the next high yielding answer that we're going to drop into that rotation and that we're going to make all of our food out of. That kind of kind of appearance of abundance in supermarkets, and our kind of lack of awareness that in fact there's probably only really 5 major plant species involved in most of the foods that we're consuming, and there could be so many more. 300,000 potentially edible plants globally, and we rely on half a dozen.
In addition to the sort of, as it were, ordinary peas, Lathyrus, there's two other genera, or three others actually, that I know about, of peas worldwide. There's the cowpeas, which is Vigna, and there's the pigeon peas, which I pronounce Cuisines. I don't know how other people say it. And then, of course, the chickpeas, which are Syca. Would you care to say anything about them? Any particularly in Britain? I mean, they're mainly associated with the tropics.
Well, I have to say, I'd thought that Vigna would be impossible in the UK. And we know some growers that are working with them in Austria, where they've got a continental climate. But last weekend, I was given a lovely jam jar full of a Vigna bean species, which I'm quite excited about.
Cowpeas.
So they're not sure entirely where they're from originally. They're called little greys, and they are little grey peas.
Okay.
And when she gave them to me, I said, "My goodness, these are Vigna." She said, "Yeah." I said, "Do you grow them in a polytunnel?" And she said, "No, we've just been growing them outside." So that's quite exciting.
That's very exciting.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there is quite a range of species within the Vigna family, isn't there?
Yeah.
So you're looking at this, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And pigeon peas, Cuisines.
I think so. Often the maple peas, or the carlin peas, they have many names: black badgers, carlin peas, grey peas. Sometimes they're called pigeon peas because they are apparently exactly the right shape for a racing pigeon. They are the pea of choice for the racing pigeon, and that causes some confusion. But I think the tropical pigeon pea is. I suspect, until someone brings me a jar and says they're growing them at home.
Yes, I mean, never say never.
Never say never.
Anything to say about chickpeas, which are very popular?
Yeah, so they're closer to our climate in terms of what they're suited to, and also sort of originated in the Fertile Crescent. But they're not. They do prefer a more continental, drier, hotter summer than we tend to have in Britain. We have been working with a couple of growers on trials of chickpeas, and we've had some successful harvests. There's also been some unsuccessful harvests, so they're just very much on the sort of marginal as a viable crop in the UK. But we're hopeful that by continuing to trial different varieties and different approaches to how they're grown, there may be more of a future for chickpeas to be grown in the UK.
Excellent.
And lentils, we've had a lot more success with. We've now got quite reliable production of lentils from a group of farmers.
Let's talk more about these. Are genus Lens, I believe.
Yeah, Lens culinaris.
Sorry?
Lens culinaris, yeah.
Lens culinaris. And there's quite a few varieties in the range of lentils.
Yes, there are. Much like Phaseolus or the peas, in fact. There are lots of different types. And we were always very keen on the idea of growing lentils, but in fact sort of ruled them out in their first years, thinking that they were too difficult and it couldn't be done. And we gradually began to see, or looking at the historic record, that there were some quite interesting kind of indications that lentils had been grown in the UK. So Thomas Tusser, in his 500 Points of Good Husbandry, talks about the time of year that you should be planting your lentils. Really? And
what century is this?
So that would be, I guess that's 16th century. I think that's late 16th century. And he was writing a poetic guide for yeoman farmers to instruct them when to plant and harvest and what to do at different times of the year. And he talks about peasen specifically. So when he talks about lens, we can be pretty sure that he's talking about lentils. Because there is in the sort of vernacular, there's a lot of confusion about the words for these different pulses, and they're interchangeable, and it can get quite confusing as to what's being spoken about. And then there are also some records really from the Northern Isles in Scotland suggesting that lentils were grown there. What we don't know is whether they were grown as a fodder crop, because they're very nutritious and livestock love lentils, or whether they were grown as a harvested crop. I think what we can be sure about is that they were a subsistence crop and they weren't traded. So they didn't really feature very heavily in those trading records from mills and from grain traders. And then a few years after that, I met some farmers in Germany. I met them in Sweden, and they'd revived some alpine lentils that they'd taken some accessions, a bit like we were discussing with the John Innes Centre, from the Vavlov gene bank in Russia, and had been recovering that tradition of growing lentils at on incredibly steep slopes in these rocky fields, and And I said, we would love to grow them in the UK. And they said, just pick a Northern European variety and have a go. And so we looked at some of the French varieties that are grown at a similar latitude to our own, but also more particularly under a very similar climate regime. And I took them to Martin Wolf at Wakelins and said to Martin, we'd like to grow lentils. And instead of saying, that's a bit daft, he said, great, let's plant some.
Good man, Mark.
So we did some plot trials with a range of different varieties under different conditions, different seed rates, and we tried intercropping them with cereals. And they got covered in grass weeds. And I went at the end of the year with some shears, really just to try and get some results from what looked like an absolute disaster. And as I pulled away the grass, I was seeing all these lentils. And I said to Martin, I think there are lentils here. And he said, let's get the plot combine. And we started harvesting them, and we had lentils. They'd matured, and we had our first small crop, which led in 2017 to commercial crops on a number of farms across the UK, which is just massively exciting, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think what that first year at Wakelins demonstrated is that, and I think this goes for all of these pulse crops, they're not natural monocultures. They, unlike cereals, which evolve in natural monocultures, in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, legumes always grow, particularly with grass plants. You see vetches twisting around grasses. And I think we've particularly in the last 100 years, with sort of commodity and industrial farming as it's emerged, and this desire to have monocultural production so that you can have a set of crop protection, herbicides and insecticides that you can use on a particular crop. We've come to think of everything in monocultural terms. This is the year you grow X, this is the year you grow Y. But actually, I think legumes do much better as a mixture, particularly with a cereal, and that there are all these co-benefits. And I think that's the case with the lentils, and I think it's the same with the peas and the beans. If you grow them on their own, they're very susceptible to a whole host of soil-borne diseases and diseases above ground, and they fall over in the field. And pests, because they're tasty.
Yeah.
Can you, doesn't it complicate harvesting? They're all grown together.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing. When you grow two plants that would normally mature at roughly the same time, within a sort of fortnight window, they sort of push each other to senesce at the same time. There's ethylene is produced, and there's sort of soil-root interactions, and they generally come to harvest at the same time.
They really do coordinate.
Yeah, they really do. Yeah, and then they can be harvested together, and modern separation equipment, optical sorting, which uses lasers to identify colour and mass and separate things, makes separation very easy. But often these things are very, they're clear contrasting sizes. Peas are very different shape to a cereal, and you can just sieve them, and they're relatively easy to separate out. What we don't have is a wider infrastructure that's geared up to do that separation, because commodity trading has become so uniform, and you have a trader that specialises in cereals or one that specialises in pulses, and they don't want to handle mixtures and separate them. But in fact, it's relatively easy to do.
That leads me on to the next sort of point, which is that agriculture as a whole has been taken over by big companies, basically. And big companies, for all sorts of reasons, like high tech. They also like monocultures. So when big companies think of pulses, they think in terms of turning them into meat substitutes, what the Germans used to call ersatz. And you're obviously very much against this, I would have imagined.
It just seems unnecessary, frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, the pulses are nutritionally so fantastic in the ways they've been cooked for thousands of years. Why do we need to do this complicated, contorted thing which involves excessive processing that almost inevitably strips out a lot of the stuff that is good about the pulses nutritionally? The more you process anything, the more you're reducing its nutritional value to create something that looks like something else, just because it's the something else that we've decided we want to eat more. Falafel is sort of the original veggie meatball, isn't it? We don't need to create something that feels more like a meatball than a falafel. We can just eat falafels.
There's a fantastic anecdote, isn't there, where we were working with a research institution, and they wanted to understand the best way to eat peas. whether they should be milled and broken down into their separate constituent parts, the starches, the fibre, the protein, or whether we should just eat them whole. And 6 months later, we went to see them and said, well, what was your conclusion? How is it best to eat peas? And they said, well, it's just to eat them as whole peas. I said, oh, really? You surprised us. And so we said, so is that the research project now is going to be about advocating the consumption of whole peas? And they said, no. The research project is to work out how to break them up into their constituent parts and do as little damage as possible. Because that's where the intellectual property is, and that's where the money is, and the value is.
Yeah,
This actually raises
a commercial imperative to add value by doing more to things, even if you just don't need to.
But this brings me to my, I suppose, penultimate point, possibly even the last, which is what are the limits of technology? I mean, you chaps are not writing off these fancy technologies a priori. Obviously, I mean, you put things in cans, which is quite high tech, really.
It is. Yeah.
We use colour sorters.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't dream of, and presumably things like bean curd, you wouldn't disapprove of. But you wouldn't sort of, as you said, try and make them into ersatz meat. Can we define where the limits of tech should be?
I think there are some really simple processes that you can carry out at home. Making a bean curd like tofu, or making a fermented product like a miso or a tempeh. Those are things that we can readily access. They're simple technologies that employ, in the case of those ferments, microorganisms to change the nutrient availability of the foodstuff. I think the thing that we're really wary of is the application of technology which divorces us from the world around us and the way that our food is produced, and that generates these new categories of intellectual property and value, which I think are reductive and problematic, both for our health and for the ecosystem that we depend on and live in.
And for people. I mean, it all increases, as you say, increases money for no particular reason.
We certainly don't write off technology per se. We're not Luddites. We're prepared to consider technology, and there are things like the colour sorter, which is used for cleaning crops up after harvest, which are fantastic and has a lot of potential. But the key questions are control and the appropriateness of that technology.
So I think in that sense we are Luddites. Because that's actually what the Luddites
yes, we're not Luddites in the sort of casual sense, but in true sense. We perhaps are, because we question the technology and whether it's appropriate, whether it has unintended consequences, which is what a lot of this sort of ultra processing of foods certainly does. It appears to be producing something that people might want to eat, but actually you've caused other harms and lost a lot of the benefits. And where it means the control over our food lies, because we all produce and consume food, and we should all have control over the food we eat. And if we're relying on very sophisticated ultra processing, we've just handed that control over to the owners of that that technology and that intellectual.
And food is, we're interested in pulses because they're a lever in a kind of broader system change. If you can put pulses into the centre of a crop rotation, you can really begin to think about the crops that you're planting around it and the benefits that come with that. And if you put pulses at the centre of the plate, then you can start to think about nutrition in a very different way. But I think if you abstract those pulses and anonymise them, it becomes a lot more difficult to have those bigger systems conversations. Right. And as an example, US produced feedlot beef is clearly an environmental disaster and a welfare disaster for those livestock that are exposed to it. But a shift to monocultural pea production in order to create an ersatz meat is, although it might be an incremental improvement on that feedlot beef situation, it's still a disaster. And we need to be thinking about the whole system in which those crops are grown, rather than just about the abstracted proteins or the systems that go with them.
Excellent.
And I think there's another aspect, which is just the enjoyment of food and the cultural richness of food. The more separation there is between who and it's produced by and where it's produced, and it being on our plate and us cooking and eating it, the more of that richness we lose, and the more devoid of enjoyment eating becomes. We eating things out of packets is never as enjoyable and as rich an experience as cooking something up, and
Indeed.
I think that's a terrible thing to lose.
Penultimate point. The governments and big commercial companies, the people that like to run our lives, pretend, I think would be the word, that there is a tremendous food problem in the world. We can't possibly produce enough. And if whatever we do produce, we've got to have a sort of fairly austere diet. But in fact, of course, people who are very well informed, like Hans Herren of the Millennium Institute, points out that at least in terms of calories and protein, we produce about twice as much as the human population needs. And of course, there's a special kind of a program attached to meat because of the intensive feedlots, which are obviously very profligate. And so there's a very anti-meat feeling. But in fact, if you look at something like pulses, well, particularly at pulses, and say, let's revisit traditional cuisines and bring them up to date and grow traditional crops in traditional ways to a large extent, then if you look at traditional cuisines, you find that all the best ones use meat very sparingly, as a garnish really, as stock, but not as a centerpiece of every meal. So if we really sort of relearnt how to cook and relearnt how to grow the kind of crops that you're talking about, food problems disappear. Am I not right?
Yes. I think simply. I think there is always this, we need to feed the world. Farmers have this obligation and responsibility to feed the world, and that's why we need this intensive, very reductive approach, which isn't actually the most productive way of producing food anyway. But that's obviously rubbish. And the problems we have are political, and they're structural, and they're around distribution and equity, not around the absolute availability of carbohydrates and protein. We do need to kind of revisit all of those. An example, we've just done some work with the Land Workers Alliance and with Pasture for Life and with Sustain, looking at the impact of soya that's used in animal feed. And about 3 million tonnes of soya are imported, mostly from fragile ecosystems, particularly in South America, every year to feed principally to pigs and poultry. And that's an invisible impact of our food. And pigs and poultry have largely kind of escaped from the stigma that's become associated with red meat, with beef and with sheep, because they're hidden away in sheds. And as you drive through East Anglia, keeping in mind that 50% of those fields of cereal that are being drilled at the moment will actually end up in those sheds feeding intensive.
Only 50%.
It's about 50%, yeah. But also all that soya coming in as well, and it's a disaster. And because of that detachment that comes with overproduction and with industrialization, we've completely lost that vision. It's not obvious on a supermarket shelf what's fed that chicken. It's just a cheap chicken.
Oh, that's wonderful. If I was 40 years younger, or perhaps even 20, I would offer to write a serious book about all that you do. It's full of good stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, fantastic. It's been a really enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, good. It's not too late to write the book either.
No.
What's that again?
Yeah,
Don't be
please
put off writing the book.
Okay.